Welcome to today's BPMD and Software AG webcast titled Agility, Efficiency, and Compliance Through Cross-Regional Process Harmonization. Today's program will be presented by BPMD's Erin Miranka. Erin is a value-driven individual with more than 20 years' experience in business process management and information technology alignment, strategy execution, training, coaching, and change management. As head of BPMD's U.S. operations, she has expertise in leading multiple functional teams while meeting aggressive business objectives and is adept at addressing the ever-changing business environment, turning issues into solutions. As we move through today's program, we invite you to submit any questions that you have. The question box is located on the left side of the webcast dashboard. Type your question into that box and hit submit when you're ready. Should we not have time to get to your question, your submission will be noted, and our speaker will be back in touch with you as soon as possible. Here now to begin today's program is Erin Miranka.
Thanks, Will. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Agility, Efficiency, and Compliance Through Process Harmonization. Process harmonization is an important topic for many organizations and has become an important component of many digital transformation initiatives. Through harmonization, an enterprise can unlock agility and efficiency, as well as improved compliance across business units, such as products groups or regional locations. Harmonization means standardizing to the right degree, identifying when variants are necessary, and how to manage them. This presentation specifically delves into an approach to achieve process harmonization and illustrates it using a case example from a joint BPMD and Software AG client in the financial services industry. From an agenda perspective, we have 3 areas that we will focus on and address for today's presentation. The first is value-driven business process management and process harmonization. That will address what exactly is process harmonization. The second is delivering process harmonization. This is where we'll roll up our sleeves and discuss a specific case example where we utilize the ARIS tool. And third, building the required process management discipline. Here we will specifically focus on, now that we've delivered the value through process harmonization, how do we sustain and grow that throughout the organization? More and more companies don't just look to improve their processes, but they look to standardize and harmonize them. These, specifically here, are just a few examples of the value of harmonization. If we specifically look at the first one on the left, harmonization aids in preparation for efficient automation and digitalization, and we will specifically see how we applied this in the case example utilizing ARIS. The second helps to maintain consistent positive customer experience. The third ensures compliance of regulations and company policies. Compliance is a huge conversation that we have with our clients. The fourth enables the right agility across the company. This specific example of value harmonization has become so very important with our ever-changing world. To be able to be agile with our processes in order to address whatever the day brings can be the difference between success and failure for an organization. So how do we take the value of process harmonization and apply it to our BPM journey? We do that by ensuring to address the discipline of business process management. Sometimes we call this the process of process management, and we do that to drive value in our approach. We approach projects based on the value delivered with a pragmatic execution, and we do this at pace. Many of the conversations we have with our clients are based on competing goals, even before we begin to discuss the specifics of a harmonization project, or any project, to be quite honest. However, if you implement a value-driven process management, whereby you adhere to and create true transparency within the organization, this will assist to alleviate any of those conflicting goals. So before I even begin to discuss the valid variance, I should start with what is standardization and what is harmonization in order to really set the stage as we progress further. Standardization is the creation of a single, common set of processes that should be used across the organization. Standard business processes make it easier for different parts of the organization to work together in order to share best practices and create synergies. This then cuts down the organizational barriers and then makes it easier to implement changes in these processes and therefore to adapt to ever-changing market conditions. This, for example, can be achieved through the automation of the business processes using a single technical system and through defining standard manual procedures that need to be implemented around the technology. This is the specific case example we utilized with ARIS. Harmonization then is specifically defined by the Business Dictionary as the adjustment of the differences and inconsistencies among different measurements, methods, procedures, schedules, specifications, or systems to make them uniform or mutually compatible. So what we're really looking at is the standards is your template, and then harmonization is that degree to which we've agreed to tweak. If we look at the examples of the allowable variance, we notice how very small they are compared to the number of, well, what I would call organizational requests for process variations. So again, if we look on the left-hand side here, look at how many of the information things that we get from businesses. Can I have cost information? What about personal choice? Well, it's worked in the past. Well, there's seasonal issues. What about volume or responsibility? This is a critical business issue. I would actually have to say that this really is where you have to draw that line in the sand with clients in regards to their processes. Because if you don't draw that line in the sand when it comes to those variants, then what you have is two different processes. Instead of creating those standards and then harmonizing them based on maybe a specific geography or a specific product or service type. This is one of those areas that you want to be very specific and make sure that you're paying a lot of attention to. Specifically, this is our ARIS case example, and I love projects. To be quite honest, I actually ran this project, so this is my sweet spot, and I'm going to take you through all of the areas. But before I do that, let me just set the stage as specifically what the project was and what it was about. So a financial services firm had a significant number of process variants in over 10 countries that was the specific regions that were in scope. This led to a mass number of inefficiencies and made it hugely difficult to adjust to any changes, especially doing anything quickly. A process harmonization leveraging the development of regional reference models using the ARIS tool addressed this challenge. That was the specific project that we were tasked. This enabled the systematic implementation of harmonized processes, as well as the ongoing improvement and governance. We're going to talk about governance in this presentation as well. So let's first go through the approach. What did we do to drive value through harmonization? So we're going to go through each of these steps, 1, 2, 3, and 4, to see what specifically we did in regards to how do we achieve that harmonization. The first thing we did was to capture the client's as-is processes. As I stated before, this showed the organization what they are doing right now and exactly how they are doing it. Many organizations have an understanding of what they do, but no transparency or details. This really set the baseline for what they're doing. We then worked to create the reference model. In this specific instance, the client was applying an automation platform. So we specifically worked with subject matter experts as well as automation vendors. If I look here and here, the biggest frequently asked question I get is why can't we just jump right to the reference model? Why can't we just go right to the future since that's what it's going to be? And we'll talk a little bit about change management in this presentation too. However, it is really critical that you understand where you are and then where you're going and then how to get there, because that gap has a lot of implications to the organization, and it starts those conversations between business and IT. And then from a third step, we then captured over here, we then captured automation and improvement opportunities for overall process efficiencies. Then in step 4, right here, we then tied all of that information together to create process harmonization. And we did that by analyzing the as-is processes against the improvement opportunities and the reference model. And then we created the to-be processes. And in regards to that, we then applied about an 80-20 rule of deviation. So that's the line in the sand that was drawn that said, these are your standards, meaning your reference model. And then this is about the area of harmonization, meaning that tweaking that you're allowed to do. And they literally, we made them justify why they were allowed to change that information. They didn't just come to us and say, we want to change A, B, C, and D. We really had the conversations with the client that really said, why are you changing it? What is the purpose behind it? And had those really made them validate that information. Oops. There we go. All right. So we are very often asked, okay, wait a second, what? Back up. How did you actually do the analysis? So let me take you through an example. The basis for any BPM project is to understand what you're doing today. Therefore, as I previously stated, we first began by capturing the as-is processes in the ARIS tool. And we did that directly by conducting subject matter expert interviews to really understand what they were doing. We also then captured improvement opportunities and created the reference model. So now onto the analysis part. Within the ARIS tool, you can create a copy of the as-is process and begin by creating what we call themes. These are consistent inefficiencies or consistent automation opportunities, as an example, that we see running throughout a majority of the processes. So let me show you the example down here if you can see it. So, and I'll move my, let's see if you can see it. All right. Okay, so at the bottom, there's a legend. And that legend right there, those legends were the themes that we saw consistently throughout all of the processes. So for example, one of the themes that we saw running consistently was they were moving from very manual processes to automation processes. And that automation was that automation platform that I was talking about. So that was one of the themes that in the to-be area, we could implement that automation. However, from that, there also was a consistent theme that when you do that, what happens is the process then changes where if those process steps become automated, that role is no longer required. So at the bottom here, if you can see that information, I'll move my cursor down here so you can see it, that role would no longer be required. So that would be removed also. The other thing that we noticed was in some of the processes, the steps were using 3, 4, 5, even more than that, technologies to get one task done. So what we really used in the improvement opportunities is we saw if we harmonized that approach, so system harmonization to reduce number of platforms, if we harmonized the approach and became more efficient, that was another theme that was very consistent throughout the processes. And another example that I'll give you on the left-hand side with the star is a centralized library system that we looked at from an implementation perspective for improvement opportunities. Sometimes many of the subject matter experts were using OneDrive and SharePoint and Google, for example, and they were going to many different areas for information that really could be contained in one area. So those were some of the themes that we specifically used that we saw consistently when we analyzed that information. And that was the first step in analysis. And that's probably the biggest question that I get when we talk about the approach is, I understand that you analyzed it, but how did you go? That's a huge jump from analyzing the information to then creating the to-be references. And that's what we really did with the analysis, was to really look at those consistencies for automation and improvement and the inefficiencies with improvement opportunities and then looked at those concurrent themes and then created a legend based on that as we then created the to-be processes. So if I move to the next, here we go. Once we then defined the themes for improvement, then we can put the different puzzle pieces together to create the reference model. So here we have the original as-is processes. So let me state again, this is an actual example from the project that I worked on. So if you look at this, this looks like a normal as-is processes. You have what triggers the process, you have the flow, you have your IT system, some data information if you're not familiar with what ARIS looks like, you have your different multiple pathways and things like that, you have ending events. So this is your as-is process. And then we created the reference model. So here's your reference model, for example. And we did that utilizing the different components as I just discussed. Specifically, this example is applying an automation platform. So as you can see, the level of automation and efficiency within the process change is pretty large. One of the things that I want to point out specifically is that you might not necessarily get this degree of simplicity in your harmonization projects or when you're creating the reference model, for example. But specifically, they did for this project because they were going from such a manual process to a very automated system. So that's where you see such a drastic change. But this is an actual real live example that we worked on for this project within ARIS. So the reference model benefits then can be seen within the organization are one, as we've already discussed, the transparency over the business impacts, especially for this one, which was the automation platform. The second specifically is something that the client was not really aware of. And the first time we did this was a very positive outcome. And that's the acceleration of the cost and time reduction in the project. So what I specifically mean by that is when we applied the reference model in the second region of the case study, the project timeline was reduced drastically due to the fact that the reference model had already been created. Therefore, our main goal then switched to straight harmonization in the region that we were looking at. So we were just harmonizing the processes. And the first several steps that we were looking at were very much reduced because we had already captured that information. So it literally reduced that specific project by 50% from when we went into phase 2, from phase 1 when we captured the original information, which was a fantastic offset from creating that reference model and how the client was able to move forward. A third benefit of the reference model is really reduction in the implementation risk. If you have information and details about your processes, and you already know what's going to happen, that really reduces the risk within an organization. And it also improves the quality by leveraging common practices. So you already know what the information is. You have an insight into what that is. And lastly, it creates a common language for transformation. How powerful is it to really have that understanding, not only to what you're doing and what the future could be, and I say could be because you have to implement that, and those implementations really start out with conversations between the business and IT. But really think about the language of business, the language of IT. There's always that bridge between business and IT. Business speaks its own language. IT speaks its own language. If you have a visual and you have data that really sets the stage for this is how we're using our technology, this is what the processes is, those processes, whether or not they're the as-is, the reference model, or the to-bes, really become that common language to bridge the gap between business and IT. So how does harmonization help to align technology and people through process models? To start, the to-be process models become a blueprint for your system configuration. In this specific case study, once we created the to-be processes with the required level of harmonization, those processes were then leveraged by the software vendor to ensure system configuration was accurate, as having exact process details is a huge success factor. It was also used then, as I just stated, as a common language, because then they could go back to the business and have specific process questions instead of just driving those conversations through technology. And this was, again, a huge success factor within that, the creation of the configuration. In the meantime, however, the as-is processes and the to-be processes were used by the business for change management purposes. So in the beginning, I said that we were going to talk a little bit about change management. Well, this is how we utilize the information that we captured between our as-is processes, the reference model, and the to-be processes to assist the organization with change management. Specifically speaking, within the ARIS tool, you can run change management reports that will assist in what roles were changed and what IT systems were changed, as just two examples. And then you use these reports specifically to communicate to the business where communication and training is required. So to give you an example, when you run the comparison within ARIS to run those change management reports, what comes out of ARIS specifically says, oh, these are the roles that specifically were using these technologies in the as-is. However, in the to-be, these same roles will now be using these technologies or won't be using these technologies. So what the business can then do is say, okay, this is the training I need. Or if the process was just made more efficient, then what the business and IT need to do is coordinate who needs training, who needs to be communicated to, how do we communicate those change management? Because change management at its core is really information, communication, and training. And utilizing a tool like ARIS, where the information is going to be pulled out of it systematically, really helps in those conversations. So if we now switch gears to, great, the project and harmonization was successful, now what? So in order to sustain that success, it's suggested to implement process governance to realize true and ongoing value. Now, don't get scared with this image. I know it does look a bit overwhelming. So let's just break it down into its core components from a process governance perspective. You can literally create a center of excellence with just a few people required, as long as you ensure to achieve the overall goal. And when I say the overall goal, we're really just addressing two specific components. The first is that you really do need a process governance in place. What is the governance? How are you governing it? What is your strategy? What is your leadership? And the second is that there is the right degree of process ownership and responsibility at the right level within the organization. So you just want to make sure that you have ownership in the organization, that your processes are being managed, and it's just not a one-off initiative and then it's shelved, because then it is going to be flat. And a process repository like ARIS can really live within your organization. One of the key success factors for a BPM project and ongoing success of BPM is to create what we call a BPM Playbook. This is a document that outlines the policies and procedures of how to conduct and set up a repository and BPM tool like ARIS. What objects were used in the project and why? What are the attributes that were created? Were they customized? What are their definitions? Was there a filter created? What does that filter look like? What were the tasks that were used? What were the objects and elements used? What were the leveling systems? And how was that applied? So ARIS is a very powerful tool, and therefore it's best practice to document how ARIS was used as part of the success of the project. So as we come to a conclusion to this presentation, I want to point out what our key takeaways are. The first is that we developed a process reference model to prepare for the process harmonization. Specifically, this helped us to set up the stage for what the standard was as we approached each of the individual regions. The second was then we applied the process reference model to identify the right degree of standardization. This specifically is where we applied that 80-20 rule and then really enforced it. The third is where we leveraged digital tools like process repositories to accelerate and sustain the harmonization. Specifically, this is where ARIS became our queen. being able to utilize a cloud-based tool to capture information and subject matter expert comments from multiple regions in multiple time zones was an absolute must and ensured our project success. Fourth, we've maintained the harmonization through an appropriate governance. You have to have ownership over your projects, and you also have ownership over your processes. And then lastly, we put this all together to create true process harmonization. For more information on BPMD, please see our website, or you can always contact me directly, as I would love to hear from you. Thank you for your time and attention today. I truly appreciate it. And Will, I'll now turn it back over to you for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. So if anybody is sitting on any questions that they have not yet submitted, now would be the time to do that. So let's get underway. The first question I have for you, what was the role of the reference model in this initiative? How can we define our own reference model, and how does ARIS come into play here?
Okay, so that sounds like it's more than one question, but I'll see if I can take it one at a time. Thank you, Will, and thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So I think the first one was, what was the role of the reference model in the initiative? So the reference model specifically set the standard. So that was the overall how we set the stage in reference to these were the acceptable processes from a regional perspective. So this is how the company said, this is what we want to do. These were where all of the subject matter experts got together and they said, for a perfect process, end to end, this is what we're going to be doing. So that reference model really set the stage for the best practice approach. So that's really how we set the stage for that. And that's the role of the reference model. Harmonization then after that came later. But I think that, what was the follow-up after that? Sorry, Will? I think there was a second part to that question.
How can we define our own reference model, and how does ARIS come into play here?
Okay, so how can you define your own reference model? I would definitely say that you need to start a BPM harmonization project, and you really want to sit down with those subject matter experts and talk about best processes. And absolutely do want to use a repository. So we would not have been successful had we not really used a tool like ARIS. So how does ARIS come into play? We had subject matter experts. As I said, there were 10 different, I think 10 plus regions in multiple different time zones. ARIS is a cloud-based tool, and that really, really helped us to, one, we did all of the capture live. So when we captured all of this information from subject matter experts, we did this live and in ARIS. So if you have subject matter experts and you want to create a reference model, you need to be able to make sure that you're pulling that information from the right people. Those right people might not be the cube next to you. So they might not even be in your time zone. So being able to utilize a cloud-based tool like ARIS really is beneficial. The second piece to that is that those end users, the people, they might not know what BPM is. They just know that they've been tagged as a subject matter expert because they have the knowledge. They got a memo, they're on this project. They don't know what business process management is. They don't know what ARIS is. They don't know what process models are. But when they start using a tool like ARIS, you can very quickly come up to speed, and you can gather information from comments section within ARIS also, so that you can go back and forth and they can leave comments. And it's very easy to be able to gather information from your end users outside of time zones and things like that. So being able to use a tool that is cloud-based and easy to use really made the difference in our success. So, Will, I think I got all three questions.
You did. Okay, next one is another two-parter. It is as follows. What is, quote, the right degree of process harmonization? How can we get the most value out of such an initiative without getting too granular or too broad?
Okay, so technically that is a two-part question, but it's really answered with one response. So the first thing is you don't want to boil the ocean. So that's very specific. So the right degree of process harmonization, and again, two things. One, you really want to apply that 80-20 rule. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you really, as a company, want to draw that line in the sand. You really want to say, okay, these are our standards, these are our best practices. And I've been on many projects, and, you know, I say to people, you might not like me by the end of the day, you know, and I kind of joke. But the reason I say that is I really enforce that line. I make people prove that there is a reason for their variant. I make the client prove, or that process, why is there a change in that task? And 9 times out of 10, I really, really go under that 20% from a project perspective. And the reason is because you want to stay as a company as close to that reference model standardization as possible. And the reason for that specifically is, you know, we've been hit over the past couple of years with you know, culture changes, worldwide changes, staffing issues, you know, all of the things that have been thrown at us as a global nation. Okay. And the companies that are successful are the ones that are very agile because they have transparency over their processes, and how that deviation away from your standardization, the less agile you're going to be able to be. Because what happens is then those 10 regions that you specifically created that standard for, the more you have deviations, the more you're specifically going to have to go in and address, you know, region number 1 and region number 2 and region number 3. And all of those processes are going to have to be addressed specifically, instead of just saying, okay, here's our reference model. What's going on in the world today? How do we tweak that to address that, and then implement that based on that 80-20 rule and how we've harmonized in all of those regions. So you want to really, when I say make that line in the sand, you really want to make that line in the sand, and you want to really keep as close to it as possible. And I really say I enforce that by making the client and or the team or the region that I'm working with, we really have, like, you know, prove it to me. You know, why do you want to change this? So I hope I've answered that question. But like I said, you know, I really say, I hope you like me by the end of the day, but the organization will appreciate it because they will be able to be agile when things come up, and you'll really be successful if you really adhere to the staying as close to that reference model as possible. Will, are there any other questions?
Yeah, following on to that then is, how can we keep the reference model current?
Okay, yep, that's a really great question. So I'll say 2 things. One, when you do use a software BPM tool like ARIS, your processes are live. So processes change with the organization. So the reference model is going to change with the organization. And probably the best thing that you can do is really implementing that process governance. You want to have ownership over the processes, which also means ownership over the reference model. And that center of excellence or that process governance that you're going to implement, it doesn't have to be something that is going to take up too much time and energy. You can really address it pragmatically, but maybe what you do is you have 3 to 4 month checks. How are we doing? How are things changing? And things like that. And you might need to tweak it here and there. You might have 6 month checks, or might have 1 month checks. It depends on how large your organization is. And it might be also the environment that you're in, so that I can't address. But really making sure that you have process governance in place is probably the best way to adhere to making sure that your reference model stays current. Will, is there anything else?
Yep, I have 2 more. So following on to that question then is, what is the role of process governance?
Okay. Yep. So I kind of touched on that a little bit, answering my other question, or the other question is, again, processes are live, just like your organization. And again, utilizing a tool like ARIS, you're going to be able to change them very quickly and adapt. And process governance is really going to make sure that you have ownership. So that's the first thing. Process governance is also going to make sure that one of the big things that we see in organization is that we'll go in and we'll do a BPM initiative. We'll create these processes, and then we kind of go away. And then what happens is if you don't implement a process governance, if you don't create a center of excellence to make sure that BPM becomes mature within the organization, what happens is does anybody use the processes? So you really want to make sure that the process governance is not just in place to govern the processes, but it also wants to make sure that you're evangelizing the project. You're evangelizing the information that you were able to drive value within the organization so you don't lose that either. So it's kind of twofold. I know it's called process governance, but you're not only just governing your processes and making sure that there's ownership and responsibility in there, but that's also an area that where you want to evangelize your processes. You want to make sure that BPM is growing within the organization and that the hard work that was done in the project, because we normally come in from a project perspective as we have 2 people on the team. So we're very, very pragmatic in our approach. And the subject matter experts, the case study that we just talked about today in this presentation, we had over 50 plus subject matter experts. So that is a lot of resources from a regional perspective. That is a lot of time, effort, and energy that the client is putting in. And what you don't want to do is at the end of the day, you don't want to lose that. So you really want to make sure that that process governance is set up correctly. So those processes are managed properly, they're owned properly, but that you also want to evangelize the information and make sure the rest of the organization knows the power behind the tool of ARIS, knows the power behind BPM, and they can also move that forward. Will,
Okay.
Is there another question?
Last one is as follows. How did ARIS aid in the process harmonization journey?
That's a great question. I think I did touch on that a little bit, but still, honestly, as I said in one of my last statements, ARIS really became our queen. And without it, we would not have been successful. When we capture information, we do it right in the tool. We do it right in ARIS. And how we actually use that for process harmonization is we did a lot of work up front to capture the information in the reference model. And specifically how ARIS was used for harmonization is now we're going into a region with subject matter experts that don't know anything about BPM. They don't know anything about ARIS. They don't know anything about the project. And very quickly, when we utilize ARIS, which is a cloud-based tool, we have it live, we have it open, they can visually see the information. And what we're asking them to do is, when we have that reference model open, as I said previously in the presentation, is you can create a copy to create that 2B area where you're going to harmonize, and we can give them examples. You have no idea the power that ARIS gives us when we can actually show them what we did in another region or show them an example that we did with another client. When you're just, talking and capturing things in an Excel spreadsheet, for example, there's not a lot of power behind that. And everyone's like, oh, here's more Excel spreadsheets. Oh, I've got to put this information together. Oh, there's nothing different here. But when you have a visual and you can dynamically show them the difference between the as is and the reference model and what their potential is and what they can change and how they can change it. And, what's the 20% that they can do when they can visually see it. And then not only that, when they can get into the tool and they can add comments and they can do it on their own, it becomes very powerful because what you do is you give them the ownership. It's not just you're taking notes in an Excel and things like that, and they're just sitting there as kind of like a cheerleader. They're actually participating in the journey and they become a part of it. And ARIS allows us to do that. And it makes a huge difference and it really aids in the overall success of the project. So, Will, was there another question?
That brings us to the end of the questions. So with that, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. The information, of course, for BPMD is on your screen, so we invite you to stay connected on LinkedIn and Twitter, and of course to visit the website at BPMD-D. .com. So with that, Aaron, you're clearly very passionate about ARIS, so thank you for a very interesting and a compelling presentation today. And thank you to BPMD for being with us. With that, our program has ended. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciate it. Bye-bye.